Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Our topic today is American history and the evolution of the pork industry. That's right, I said pork as in pig. My guest today is Dr. Brett Mizelle. Dr. Mizelle is a professor of history and he is also the director of the American Studies program. Welcome, Brett, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points.
It's great to be here.
And appropriate to this discussion, you've written a book which is titled Pig, which I'm presenting to the audience right now. I've had a chance to read the book, and it's an interesting analysis of the human and pig relationship through history, especially in American history. And I wanted to ask you, in terms of the main theme, consistent thread that runs through the book about this human-pig relationship, what's the main takeaway?
Yeah, the main takeaway in pig is that pigs have been both materially and culturally central to the ways humans have built their worlds for the last 10,000 years. It's an animal that I think needs a reconsideration for the role that it's played in both human diets, but also in the way we understand the world through the ways pigs are used in language, culture, media, and so forth. And I wrote the book largely to retrieve the pig, I think, from some of these cultural images we have of pigs to remind us of their real existence, which is to be raised and to be killed by the millions for food.
And as you were saying, pigs were one of the first animals to be domesticated, certainly to be herded as livestock, if you will. What was it about the pig that made them an ideal commodity for becoming livestock?
Pigs were a very useful animal for domestication because they share environments with humans so readily. So one of the arguments made about domestication by most scholars these days is that it wasn't an example of people domesticating the animal. It's almost like a mutual agreement where like the pigs kind of choose to be domesticated. Some wild boars benefited from being close to human societies because they could live off the scraps and the waste generated by those groups. And those pigs gradually became acclimated to people and became, in essence, what we now know as a domesticated animal. So there's been a long partnership between humans and pigs since domestication began.
So they're easily domesticated. Does that have something to do with their intelligence?
Certainly. Pigs are very social animals. They're very intelligent animals. Most of the modern day studies indicate pigs kind of operate at the intelligence level of a 3 or 4-year-old human. And they're very social, and they like being around both other pigs and other people in a lot of cases. So they're very easy animals to kind of keep in a wide variety of husbandry styles. So I think in the US we're used to seeing pigs on farms or increasingly in factory farms, but people can keep pigs in all kinds of conditions, in part because pigs can be kept in a kind of a free-range style of living. That made it even easier for a lot of people to keep pigs in different parts of the world.
And so if we focus on American history and how pigs arrived here, they're not native to the New World. So they were brought here by Columbus and the other explorers, the conquistadors and so forth. And how did the arrival of pigs affect the native folks that were living here in the New World, and how did it affect the growth of the colonies?
Pigs are, yes, as you mentioned, not native to North America, and so they're brought over by Spanish explorers, and they reproduced incredibly quickly in the New World environment. There was plenty of food for them to eat, plenty of land for them to forage upon. And in fact, there's a famous environmental historian, Alfred Crosby, who said that if you were in a UFO, hovering above North America in, say, 1500, you would think, in fact, that there was a grand conspiracy to replace native peoples on the continent with pigs, because the native peoples were dying from the diseases that the Europeans brought over. And the pigs were thriving in really, really great numbers. As early as around 1600, colonists are already complaining about the problems that these pigs are causing for them. They're raiding stocks of food, they're breaking down fences and getting into crops. And so pigs created a lot of conflict, not just within colonial settlements, but they created real problems between the colonists and Native Americans. In fact, Virginia Anderson, who's a historian at UC Boulder, has argued that most of the conflicts between Indians and colonists are caused by animals, by livestock, because livestock roamed in and destroyed Indian crops or were, in the other cases, shot by Native Americans, right, as a food supply. So pigs created a lot of controversy, in essence, in the colonial period.
And I think another important aspect of this is the fact that pigs, when they breed, they can have large litters, much more so than cattle, which go one at a time and so on. So maybe we could talk about that for a moment.
For sure, pigs were a great food source because of that. Once you have a couple of pigs, they start producing. You just have lots of pigs running around the woods. And so they were the #1 food source in colonial America. Today, pork is the #3 ranked meat in the United States and has been on a steady decline. But for much of American history, the main meat people would eat, partly because of its abundance, was pork from all of these pigs, both domesticated ones and also what I call wild living pigs that were somehow a mix of wild boar or pigs that had escaped or just pigs running through the woods.
And so as we talk about pork becoming a staple in the American diet, this was really important, especially in the South prior to the Civil War. And during this early part of the 19th century, we're talking about the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, Cincinnati, the city of Cincinnati figures into the pork equation. How so?
Yeah, so most people raised pigs locally in kind of their communities, and pigs traditionally were slaughtered around November, December as it started getting colder, because you needed the cold to help preserve the meat and then prepare to smoke the meat and so forth. What happens over the course of the 1820s, 30s, and 40s is that people start consolidating in Cincinnati a pork industry, right? So Cincinnati becomes known as Porkopolis, and farmers from around the South and Midwest would drive their pigs on foot. There are great accounts of tens of thousands of pigs being driven down the roads, which must have been quite a sight, into a city like Cincinnati, which was completely swarming with hogs. And so travelers' accounts of early Cincinnati discuss constantly how many pigs are roaming around the streets. And so entrepreneurs there, including ones we still know today, like Procter & Gamble, create kind of new forms of disassembling the pig in these newly created slaughterhouses. And then they start using pigs for all kinds of products, not just food that they could ship down the rivers, down the Ohio River and the Mississippi River and on American canals, but all other kinds of products. And that's where we start thinking about that idea that they use everything but the squeal.
And as far as the slaughtering and packaging of pork products, this is where the pork barrel comes into being. What about the pork barrel?
Right, so we use that phrase a lot and we forget that it means something, right? We talk about pork barrel politics. Most of the pork people ate was not fresh because there's no refrigeration. You had to have a store of ice. You would have fresh pork when you killed a pig in the winter, but most of the year the pork you ate was salted and barreled. And there were various grades. There were 9 official grades of barreled pork. And that pork was then shipped all over the place. It was really well preserved. And that's where we get a couple phrases. One is about the pork barrel itself in terms of kind of a bounty you see there, but also the phrase scraping the bottom of the barrel, right? Which kind of meant you were getting literally low on the food supply.
Okay, and so being near those rivers in Cincinnati was important for the shipping, as you mentioned, so they would put the barrels onto the ships?
Yes, they would use the barrels basically of pork and then could move them all around the world. So there's a great account of Cincinnati by Frederick Law Olmsted, the famous architect and designer of Central Park, where he even mentions that some of that pork went overseas. It was barreled up and shipped across into Europe. So we really start developing not just a domestic pork industry, but an export industry during this period of time.
And then after the Civil War, the pork industry moved to Chicago, and then we know about the big slaughterhouses and so forth in Chicago. And this was written about by Upton Sinclair in his famous book, The Jungle, in 1906. He had a certain agenda with that book, and the agenda that he wanted wasn't necessarily the one that caught the attention of the American public. What was it about that book, The Jungle, that caught the attention of the American people?
Yeah, so by 1900, Chicago was the hog butcher of the world, is the phrase that they think about, and most meat is slaughtered there, and partly tied again to a new technology. If the earlier technology was canals and rivers, it's the railroads that helped make Chicago kind of the great city that it became. And so Sinclair really started writing as a radical about labor politics. He was really interested in the plight of the workers working in Chicago's factories, and what he said about his own book eventually was, I aimed to hit people in the heart about labor, but I actually wound up hitting them in the stomach because it was the passages about the poor quality of food and the adulteration of the food supply that really captured the national imagination.
And I think you mentioned in the book that they were using borax as a preservative or something along those lines?
All kinds of terrible preservatives, yeah. There were really no standards for what constituted safe meat, and this has been a long-running issue in the United States, really until after the jungle and the creation of the Food and Drug Administration, which starts creating standards. Yeah, there were all kinds of shortcuts taken to preserve meat, and borax was one way that could be done to kind of speed up that process at a cost to human health.
And this was at the time when President Theodore Roosevelt was in charge, and he saw to it that we did have some concern about, I guess, food safety.
Yeah, and food safety becomes really an issue for the last 100 years in American history, more so than it had been beforehand. Although a lot of people today still argue we're not doing enough to pay attention to questions of food safety.
Right. Okay, so as we move again into the end of the 19th century, we see that there are different ways in which pork is being packaged and sold and marketed. Sausages, for example, and then hot dogs, which are a form of a sausage, I guess. And then in the 1930s, Spam, which I believe refers to spiced ham. It's an abbreviation of spiced ham.
Right.
And it became very popular in the 1930s and in the 40s when American troops would take Spam with them on overseas missions into the Pacific Islands. What happened as a result of that, taking Spam into the Pacific Islands?
Yeah, one of the things I chart in the book is the emergence of convenient meat, right? Trying to make meat more convenient. And as you mentioned, sausages and hot dogs do that. And there's a great debate, an endless one really, about where the first hot dog is. But Spam, we know the history of. It's a Hormel product. The idea was to create a canned and preserved ham that could be shipped all over the place. And you're right, it becomes a very important food in World War II and is particularly still popular. The most Spam in the country is consumed in Hawaii, largely because of the legacy of World War II in the Pacific.
And I think you mentioned Guam as well.
Right.
It's very popular in Guam.
Yeah, popular in all of these kinds of places. Now, of course, one of the great ironies is that Spam is kind of seen as gross, and it became the nickname for junk email, right? That kind of idea. The current acronym, in fact, I hear most for Spam is something posing as meat.
Okay. Well, as we move forward into the 20th century, in the 1950s, we had a Secretary of Agriculture under the Eisenhower administration by the name of Ezra Taft Benson, and he had a quote about farming and this applied to hog farming. And what was that quote and how did it affect the pork industry?
Yeah, after World War II, there was a great green revolution in producing food for the world and for a growing population. And the great comment that came out of the government was get big or get out, right? Really trying to tell farmers that you really didn't have a future as a small independent farmer. You had to consolidate, you had to have more and more animals, and you had to start keeping them in a different style. That style is a confinement agricultural style, where you basically raise the sows and piglets in one place, and then you finish the animals in another place, basically. So you fatten them up until they're at slaughter weight. And this leads to a process that's still ongoing of great consolidation in the pork industry, where once there were lots of independent hog farmers all around the country in every community, nowadays there's kind of a handful of major corporations that run most of the pork industry.
And I think you said that in the book you mentioned that the state of Iowa had large farms, small farms, medium-sized, everything you can imagine in the hog industry, but now it's all been consolidated and about 83% of those small farms are gone now.
Yeah, it's amazing the charts. There's a chart you can see that I sometimes use with my students where you have kind of little dots for where all the farms were and they all just become conglomerated together in a particular period. I found a great cultural manifestation of that in my research was that once upon a time, dozens of states had pork queens, right? All of these farmers would nominate their daughters to be the pork queen to represent the industry at state fairs. And now only one state has them, that's Iowa, right? There's no longer that many families involved in pork. It's such a big industry now and so consolidated that you've lost that contact between the ordinary person or the ordinary farmer and the livestock.
And with that, we're going to take a break. And when we come back from the break, we'll talk more about that important relationship between humans and pigs. Stay with us.
Is law school in your future? A degree in history would be the perfect major for a student going in that direction. Perhaps you like historic preservation, or maybe government work in a federal, state, or local level. They're the largest employers in the nation, and they are looking for people with that kind of degree. The opportunities are endless with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly. My guest today is Brett Mizelle. Brett, before we went to the break, we were talking about the large consolidation of major hog farming operations and the pork industry and how it really is an assembly line from birth of the pig or even before the birth of the pig because they use so much artificial insemination. But from the very beginning to the slaughter, it's a mass production operation which doesn't think much about or doesn't take into account much in regard to how the pig feels along the way. Talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, one of the great casualties of the consolidation of the industry has been the welfare of animals themselves. And one of the things that the industry has done in partnership with the government basically is redefine what welfare is. So welfare itself has been redefined to basically allow practices that most people think are not good for animal welfare. For example, not allowing sows to stand up and turn around, right, to confine them in gestation crates, has defined that as the new normal. So the great cost really has been taken out kind of on pigs themselves through the ways we've modified their bodies through breeding and through the ways they're kept in these confinement agriculture. Again, as you mentioned, from birth, from sows and piglets and gestation crates through these massive, massive finishing buildings that have 1,500 or 2,000 pigs in them apiece.
And of course, the main objective is to make the pig as fat as possible, as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. The goal has always been to get the meat finished as quickly as possible. And that's been done in a lot of ways, mainly through selective breeding of pigs to find the ones or to select for the ones that put on meat the fastest. Today's pigs, most people are shocked to learn, never make it to 6 months old. They're usually already up at about the 230 to 250 pound slaughter weight by then.
As you mentioned in the book, the ideal pig, I guess, if we were going to design a pig for this purpose, for this specific purpose, it would be a pig that could stand on a 2x7 cement slab its entire life and also not get bored silly standing there.
Yeah, and they're trying to figure out how to do that, right? How do you kind of engineer the pig to thrive in these kinds of environments? One of the things that I found really interesting at a pig industry event I went to was that some of the farmers talked kind of candidly about the things they can't overcome. One of the things they can't overcome is natural seasonality in when sows give birth. They tend not to give birth, over the history of the pig species in the summer months when it's the hottest. And there are still some things like that that are hardwired into the pig genome that they haven't been able to overcome. But in every other way, they basically have created a new pig. There's almost no real similarity in some senses between the pigs you would have seen in 1500 in the United States and the pigs you would see in industrial agriculture today. It's a different animal. It's an animal that's been created for the industry.
And you mentioned in the book that for the workers in this industry, this is a repetitive and rather brutish kind of job, which accounts for the fact that you mentioned in one case there was a plant where 5,000 people were hired one year and 5,000 people quit in that year. So there's a 100% turnover?
Yes, it's a terrifying job. There's a lot of exploitation in the industry. A lot of the work is incredibly low wage. It's repetitive. It's physically dangerous, both in raising the pigs, but particularly in the disassembly line, with the speed of the line in terms of how quickly they're processing pigs. And as a result, those jobs in America have largely become jobs for entry-level immigrants, some legal but many illegally, which explains partly the high turnover in a lot of these plants. One of my interests in the book is thinking about multi-species justice. In fact, you can make the case that there are multiple victims really in the way the hog industry is organized, the pigs themselves, but also the workers who are in essence confined with them and consigned to particular types of brutal labor.
And there's been reaction to these conditions in these large hog operations, and the public has weighed in on this. In fact, here in California, the citizens passed Prop 2 in 2008 in regard to this. What was Prop 2 and how does it affect the hog industry here?
Yeah, Proposition 2 was an animal welfare referendum, basically, and its main effect on pigs was to ban gestation crates. The idea was that it was common sense that pigs should be able to stand up and turn around, move around, and so forth, and not be confined facing in one direction in a small cage all their life. And it passed pretty overwhelmingly. I want to say 67% of the population favored that. It went into effect January of this year, January 2015. And interestingly, the pig portions had very little effect in California because, as it turns out, California doesn't have that many large factory hog farms. It had a great effect in California on the chicken industry, but less on pigs. But it does indicate, I think, that the public is starting to think differently about where their meat comes from, and not just the quality of that meat, but the way that the animals are treated in this agricultural industry.
And that brings up the next question, which is the grocery store seems to put distance between the food source and the consumer. To the consumer, you walk in, you buy that meat, it's packaged a certain way, it looks wonderful, you take it home, you don't think about where it came from. So if we could explore that for a moment, how does the modern food industry, grocery stores and so forth, put distance and essentially alienation between the human and the food source, which is the animal?
Yeah, the grocery store is a great way to think about that. Today in the grocery store, meat is shrink wrapped in little portions, or it's already on a kebab or pre-marinated, or as I saw at one point, there's already pre-cooked bacon, right? So you don't even have to bother cooking the animal. And it's part of a long history, I think, of separating people from the actual experience of and connections to animals in the animal industry. People just don't see pigs anymore, right? Pigs are raised for food in confinement agriculture, so you don't actually see animals on farms. People don't have that connection. And I think one of the reasons places like Whole Foods are popular is that they're telling a story about connection. When you go to Whole Foods, you'll see signs saying that these pigs or this food product comes from this farmer. So I think increasingly consumers want to have a connection with where their food is coming from, one that's been largely denied in the history of the industry, which has always been about producing inexpensive and abundant meat.
Well, let's talk now about the sort of cultural connections between humans and pigs, because we started out by talking about there's a long-standing relationship between pigs and humans. And we've seen this in literature. We've seen books like Charlotte's Web. We've seen books like Animal Farm. And certainly Miss Piggy in The Muppets is a very popular character. And even Winston Churchill had an interesting quote where he said, essentially, I'm probably paraphrasing here, but he said, "I like pigs. Dogs look up to us, cats look down at us, but pigs consider us their equals." So what about that cultural connection and literature and various other ways in which we've actually put pigs in center stage?
Much of the book is dedicated to thinking about the resemblances and commonalities between humans and pigs, and there are lots of them. Some of them are medical. In fact, pigs are the best animal model for human health, and we have a lot of interchange between human and animal medicines in the pig sector. A lot of people have pig heart valves, for example, as part of them, or the blood thinner heparin, for example, is made from pigs. So there are a lot of histories of that kind of connection with pigs that you see in that Churchill quote. There's something about pigs being more like us, seeming more equal to us. And so they played a huge role in literature and culture for thousands of years. You mentioned a couple of my favorite books that I write about in there, particularly books like Charlotte's Web or a book like Babe, which I think are books that focus in particular on individual animals, right? They tell the stories of spectacular pigs, right? Wilbur is terrific. He is some pig. And these are kind of the animals that kind of attract our cultural attention. One of the things that I do say about that in the book, though, is that they focus us on an individual pig that is exceptional, and that those texts often make us forget the sheer numbers of pigs involved in industrial agriculture.
Right, and as we talk about pigs and culture and literature and so on, we talked earlier about the phrase pork barrel and how today that's considered a negative. If you talk about pork barrel politics, it means that somebody is trying to take advantage of the taxpayers to basically divert money to a project that's probably unworthy. And we have all kinds of other phrases about pigs. You live in a pigsty, or you're greedy like a pig, or another one is you're going hog wild. Why so many references to pigs and hogs, and why are those references almost invariably negative?
Yeah, it's interesting, the negative association history with pigs, associated with drunkenness and with filth, and most of those have to do, in fact, with the way we keep pigs. Pigs themselves, for example, are very clean animals, right? They're very, organized socially, and they keep their kind of, nesting areas separate from the rest of the areas where they live. But because we tend to keep them in mud and filth and feed them scraps, and we think of the pigs particularly hurrying to kind of, wolf down their dinner in that kind of sense, we have all of these associations that are largely negative with pigs. And one of the things I'm interested in the book is trying to change some of those associations and think about more positive connections that people have with pigs.
And pigs are also blamed for diseases like H1N1, quote unquote, swine flu. Why do they get the blame for these diseases when 99.9% of the folks get the disease from other humans, not from animals?
Pigs have been a very interesting vector of disease in the past. And the recent swine flu epidemic a couple years ago was one where it was kind of really a tragedy for a lot of pigs. As you point out, pigs are not directly transmitting that disease to humans. It's a human-to-human spread disease. But in many parts of the world, pigs were eradicated. So for example, I have a section in the book where I talk about how in Egypt they got rid of all of the pigs in the city of Cairo because of the fears of swine flu, even though the pigs had nothing to do with kind of the disease there. And the funny irony, of course, is it left a major garbage crisis for the city because there were no longer these animals to process all of the organic waste. Pigs were very important to the subsistence cycle and for recycling in cities.
Well, let's talk about the return of pigs to the wild, because we have a number of feral pigs. When I say a number, we're talking about millions. in this country. How do pigs become feral, and what's the problem when they do become feral?
The great surprise to me in doing the research on the book was how significant the feral pig problem is. So feral pigs are often escaped pigs that have escaped from factory farms or from other farms, but they're also can interbreed with wild boar. So I tend to use the phrase wild living pigs because it's really not clear where they are. But they're a problem in most of the US states. They chew up agriculture, they destroy farms, they destroy golf courses, but the big issue really is spreading disease. The most famous instance that I know of that's in the book is here in California. Several years ago, some people got sick and died from E. coli on organic spinach. And for a long time, scientists couldn't figure out how did the E. coli get on the spinach. And it turned out it was because of these wild living pigs. The pigs had run through a hog farm, through a cattle farm, and picked up the E. coli, and then they were the vector that transmitted the pathogen to the spinach that got people sick.
Right. And so there are actually provisions for hunting these feral pigs, even here in California. And I think you mentioned in the book that something on the order of 30,000 pigs a year are shot by hunters?
Yes, and there's open season pretty much year-round in California on pigs, particularly in the Central Valley, where it's obviously a huge problem given the nature of agriculture there. In the end of Michael Pollan's book on the different kind of 4 food groups, he starts with kind of eating at McDonald's and works his way through. The last episode of that book is having a meal of a basically free-living pig he himself shot here in California. So it's a big problem, and there's a growing market for hunts, basically, to kind of control these populations.
We just have less than a minute to go here, so in about 30 seconds or less, if you could just comment on what we need to do to basically let pigs be pigs and still maintain an agricultural industry that provides meat that's affordable to consumers.
Yeah, I think the change there is going to be slow to come, but I think one of the things Americans need to realize is that the way the industry is operated is not sustainable. It's not sustainable for animals or for labor or for our own health and the environment. And so I think Americans are going to have to learn to think of meat as a special food again, like it was for much of American history, to think of meats as a seasoning, right? To maybe eat less pork, but eat better pork and support the types of farmers who are doing the right thing, trying to raise pigs in a way that sort of support the natural living and lifestyles and habits of the pigs.
Basically back to the family farmer, I guess.
In some ways, yes, which is hard to do given growth of populations and all of that. It's going to be a sticky wicket to solve.
Well, thank you for joining us today, and we appreciate your presence here on Talking Points.
Thanks.
And thank you for joining us. Join us again soon for another episode of Talking Points. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.